The morning Douglas Albert Monroe was born in Vancouver, Washington in 1919, the world was still counting its dead from the war that was supposed to end all wars. His first breath came in a nation weary of conflict, a generation determined to find peace in the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. The Pacific Northwest shaped him in those early years, the constant presence of water, the discipline of seasons, the understanding that nature demanded respect and gave none freely. His family wasn't wealthy, but they possessed something more valuable in those uncertain times. A belief that service to something greater than oneself was the highest calling a person could answer. Growing up along the Columbia River, young Douglas watched the water ceaselessly. He saw how it could be gentle in the morning light, how it could turn treacherous when the wind picked up, how men who understood its moods could navigate what defeated others. The river taught patience, taught humility, and perhaps, though no one could have known it then, it was preparing him for a destiny that would unfold on waters half a world away. By the time Douglas Monroe turned 20 in 1939, the world his parents had hoped would remain peaceful was fracturing again. In Europe, darkness was spreading. In Asia, empires clashed. America watched from across two great oceans, still hoping distance would be enough. But some young men sensed what was coming. On a spring day that year, Douglas Monroe walked into a Coast Guard recruiting station and raised his right hand. He didn't join for glory, men from his background rarely did. He joined because when he looked at the world around him, he understood that the things worth protecting would need defending, and that someone had to be willing to stand in the gap. The Coast Guard in those days was a service most Americans barely thought about. They knew about the Army, storied and traditional. They knew about the Navy, grand and powerful. The Marines had their legendary reputation. But the Coast Guard, that small, specialized force charged with saving lives at sea, with patrolling coastlines, with the unglamorous but essential work of maritime safety, operated in the shadows of public consciousness. Those who joined it were a particular breed. Men who understood small boats and rough water, who possessed a peculiar combination of technical skill and raw courage, who could handle a vessel in conditions that would break lesser sailors. Monroe proved himself ideal for this service. His training began with communications. Morse code tapped out in endless practice sessions, semaphore flags waving through prescribed patterns, blinker lights flashing messages across the darkness. He absorbed it all with quiet competence. The instructors noted his steadiness, his ability to remain calm when others grew flustered, his knack for getting things right when it mattered most. But it was when he trained as a coxswain, the skilled operator who commanded small landing craft, that Monroe truly found his calling. To be a coxswain required more than mechanical knowledge. It demanded an intuitive feel for water and wind, an ability to read waves and currents, a precise understanding of how a heavily loaded boat would respond in surf. The Coast Guard surfmen were legendary for these skills. Generations of knowledge passed down from men who'd pulled drowning sailors from winter seas, who'd navigated tiny boats through conditions that seemed impossible. Now, as war clouds gathered, these skills would be needed for a different purpose. In the waters off Chesapeake Bay and along the North Carolina coast, Monroe and his fellow Coast Guard coxswains trained Navy personnel in the demanding art of surf handling. The Navy was rapidly expanding, preparing for a conflict everyone now understood was inevitable. They were building landing craft by the hundreds, planning amphibious operations that would require putting thousands of men ashore under fire. But building boats was easier than training the men to handle them. That's where the Coast Guard came in. Day after day, the surfmen taught Navy coxswains how to time waves, how to approach a beach at the right angle, how to read the water beneath them, how to extract a stranded boat from sand and undertow. It was grueling, repetitive work, and it would save countless lives in battles yet to come. Then, on a Sunday morning in December 1941, the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, and America's reluctant watch ended. The nation plunged into war, and suddenly the Coast Guard's specialized skills became desperately needed. The service was transferred to Navy control, its cutters deployed to combat zones, its small boat handlers assigned to the massive invasion fleets being assembled. Douglas Monroe, now a signalman first class, received orders that would take him to the other side of the world, to islands whose names most Americans had never heard, to a campaign that would test everything he'd learned and demand everything he could give. The Solomon Islands hung like a ragged chain in the South Pacific, remote and jungle-choked, a place where the humid air felt thick enough to chew. In the summer of 1942, these islands became the focal point of a desperate struggle. The Japanese were advancing, establishing bases, threatening Australia itself. If they weren't stopped, the entire Pacific might fall. American strategists identified Guadalcanal as the place to make their stand, the first major offensive operation in a war that had, until then, brought only retreat and defeat. The invasion fleet that assembled for Operation Watchtower was unlike anything the Americans had yet attempted. Dozens of transports, escorted by warships, carrying thousands of Marines who would storm ashore to seize the island and its partially completed airfield. Among the armada were hundreds of landing craft, Higgins boats they were called, flat-bottomed vessels designed to drive straight onto a beach, drop their front ramps, and disgorge troops directly into combat. Manning many of these boats were Coast Guard coxswains, their peacetime skills now applied to the most violent purpose imaginable. Douglas Monroe was among them. In early August, he guided his landing craft toward Tulagi, a small island across from Guadalcanal where the Japanese had established a seaplane base. The Marines he carried were tense, gripping their rifles, faces sheened with sweat that wasn't entirely from the tropical heat. Many had never seen combat. Some wouldn't survive the day. Monroe's job was to get them there, to navigate through the offshore waters, time his approach to the beach, bring them in close enough that they could wade ashore rather than drown in deep water with their heavy packs. The morning exploded in fire as the landing craft approached. Japanese defenders, dug into the jungle, opened up with everything they had. Machine gun fire stitched the water. Mortar rounds erupted in columns of spray. The sound was overwhelming. The roar of boat engines, the crack of rifles, the screams of wounded men, the crash of surf against steel hulls. Monroe kept his hands steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the beach, his mind calculating angles and depths and timing. Around him, other coxswains were doing the same, each one responsible for dozens of lives, each one knowing that a mistake meant men drowning or dying before they even reached the fight. He brought them in. The ramp dropped, and the Marines splashed forward into waist-deep water, weapons held high, struggling toward the beach while bullets kicked up spray around them. Monroe's job now was to reverse off the sand, swing the boat around, and head back for another load. But as he maneuvered away from shore, he saw wounded men being dragged back toward the water's edge, medics working frantically, Marines waving desperately for evacuation. The doctrine was clear. Get the fresh troops in, get the wounded out. Don't let the boats sit still. A stationary target died quickly. For hours, Monroe made run after run. His landing craft became streaked with blood, the deck slippery where wounded Marines had been laid. The battle for Tulagi raged with a savagery that shocked even veteran observers. The Japanese defenders fought from caves and bunkers, making the Americans pay for every yard. But by nightfall, the island was in Marine hands, though at terrible cost. That night, Monroe's communications training proved its worth. With his landing craft positioned offshore, he used his blinker light to coordinate between ships and shore parties, flashing messages through the darkness while Japanese snipers tried to target the light source. Other men might have been tempted to reduce the light's brightness or flash from behind cover, but Monroe understood that clear communication saved lives. He kept signaling, methodical and precise, helping organize the evacuation of wounded and the delivery of supplies, his light a small beacon of order in the chaos. Over the following weeks, as the Marines consolidated their hold on Guadalcanal and fought off increasingly desperate Japanese counterattacks, the war settled into a grinding struggle. The jungle was merciless. Oppressive heat, torrential rain, disease, and insects that seemed designed specifically to torment. Japanese bombers came almost daily. Their warships prowled the waters at night, leading to savage naval battles that turned the channel between the islands into a graveyard of steel. And all the while, the Marines on shore fought, starved, sickened, and died, while the landing craft kept coming, bringing supplies and reinforcements, evacuating the wounded, maintaining the thin lifeline that kept the entire operation alive. Douglas Monroe spent those weeks in constant motion. He learned to recognize the different sounds of incoming fire, to sense when a wave pattern was changing, to judge by the sound of his engine when something needed attention. He learned which beaches were safe to approach and which were death traps. He got to know the Marines, learned their units, their officers, their situations. The relationship between the landing craft crews and the men they transported became intensely personal. These weren't just anonymous soldiers. They were specific men with names and faces, and every trip ashore or offshore was a shared gamble with death. By late September, the Marines were desperate to expand their defensive perimeter. The Japanese held strong positions just a few miles from the airfield, and until those positions were eliminated, the entire Guadalcanal operation remained vulnerable. A battalion was to be inserted by landing craft at a point called Point Cruz, where they could strike at the Japanese from an unexpected angle. It was a risky operation. The beach was narrow, backed immediately by jungle, and certainly watched. But risks had become routine, and routine meant that men sometimes forgot to be afraid. Monroe's landing craft was assigned to the operation. September 27, 1942, dawned hot and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. Monroe checked his boat with the thoroughness that had become second nature: engine, controls, radio, weapons. His craft carried a .30 caliber machine gun mounted forward, a weapon he'd trained with but hoped not to use. Coxswains were boat handlers first, but in the close chaos of amphibious warfare, they often found themselves fighting. He test-fired the weapon, the sharp rattle momentarily cutting through the ambient noise of a military encampment preparing for action. The Marines loaded in silence. These were veterans now, men who'd survived weeks of combat, who'd lost friends and learned hard lessons. They knew what to expect. They settled into the cramped space of the landing craft with the economy of movement that combat teaches, weapons ready, eyes distant. Monroe recognized some faces, nodded to men he'd carried before. There was comfort in that recognition, a sense that they were all in this together, that the man driving the boat understood what waited ahead. The run toward Point Cruz began smoothly. Monroe's craft was part of a small flotilla, several landing boats carrying the Marine battalion toward their objective. The water was calm, the morning sun already brutal. For a few minutes, it almost seemed routine, just another insertion, just another beach. Then the world exploded. The Japanese had been waiting. They'd watched the landing craft approaching, had ranged their weapons, and now they opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns raked the water. Mortars walked across the waves, throwing up geysers. Artillery from hidden positions inland began crashing down around the boats. The Marines in Monroe's craft pressed low, but there was nowhere to hide, no protection except the thin metal hull that might as well have been paper against the incoming fire. Monroe's training took over. His hands moved automatically, adjusting course, timing his approach, looking for any advantage the terrain might offer. He saw the reef, a coral barrier just offshore that complicated the landing, and made instant calculations about depth and timing. The other coxswains were making the same judgments, each one trying to find a way through the maelstrom of fire to get their Marines ashore. The landing craft grounded on sand. The ramp dropped. The Marines surged forward into withering fire. Monroe saw men fall before they'd taken 3 steps. Others made it into the jungle, disappearing into the green shadows. The volume of enemy fire was stunning. This wasn't a defended position. It was a killing zone. The Japanese had turned this beach into an ambush, and now the Marines were caught in it. Monroe's orders were to withdraw once his troops were ashore, to head back for another load or stand by for evacuation orders. But as he backed off the beach, he heard the frantic radio calls. The Marines were pinned down, taking casualties, unable to advance or withdraw. Other landing craft had grounded on the reef and were stuck, their Marines trapped aboard while Japanese fire concentrated on them. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, tipping toward disaster. He saw one of the stranded landing craft clearly. It was hung up on coral, its coxswain desperately trying to reverse off while bullets hammered the hull. The Marines aboard were returning fire, but they were exposed, vulnerable, dying. In minutes, that boat would be shot to pieces, everyone aboard killed or wounded. Someone had to do something. Douglas Monroe made his decision without consulting anyone. He swung his landing craft around and headed back toward the reef at full throttle. His crew looked at him in shock. They were heading into the worst of the fire, not away from it. But Monroe's face was set, determined, and they understood. They manned their positions, and as they approached the stranded boat, Monroe's machine gunner opened up on the Japanese positions, laying down suppressing fire. Monroe brought his craft alongside the trapped boat, using his hull to shield it from the worst of the incoming fire. Bullets rang off the metal. Splashes erupted all around them. The noise was indescribable. Engines, gunfire, explosions, men shouting. Monroe stood at his controls, fully exposed, directing the rescue. The Marines from the stranded boat scrambled aboard his craft, pulling wounded men with them, trying to move fast while Japanese machine gunners tried to cut them down. The other coxswain finally got his boat free of the reef. Both craft should have fled immediately, racing away from the beach and the killing fire. But Monroe saw more Marines on the shore, pinned down, calling for evacuation. The operation had failed. Now it was about saving as many men as possible. He started toward the beach again. His crew and the Marines they'd rescued were firing continuously now, trying to suppress the Japanese long enough to extract the stranded men. Monroe maneuvered his craft with precision that seemed impossible under the circumstances, bringing the bow close enough that Marines could wade out and scramble aboard. The boat was overloaded, riding low in the water, but he kept it stable, kept it positioned, even as the enemy fire intensified. Then he felt the impact. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies, no explosion, no spinning around, just a sharp, hot punch to his chest, and suddenly it was very hard to breathe. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his uniform. His hands, almost of their own accord, kept gripping the controls. The boat had to stay steady. The Marines had to get aboard. Nothing else mattered. His crew was shouting, trying to reach him, but he waved them back. "Keep firing," he tried to say, though his voice came out weak. The world was getting distant, sounds fading as if he were underwater. But through the gathering fog, he had one clear thought, one question that needed answering. He turned his head, trying to see the beach, trying to count Marines, trying to make sure. "Did they get off?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Did all the Marines get off? A crewman was beside him now, trying to staunch the bleeding, but Monroe's eyes were insistent, demanding an answer. The crewman looked toward shore, then back to Monroe. "Yes," he said, and whether it was true or a mercy, Monroe seemed to accept it. His hands finally loosened on the controls. Someone else took over, steering the overloaded craft away from the beach at maximum speed. Japanese fire still pursuing them, but growing more distant. Douglas Albert Monroe died before they reached the safety of the transport ships. He was 23 years old. He'd been in combat for less than 2 months. In that short time, he'd made dozens of landings under fire, saved countless lives, and in his final moments, given everything he had to ensure others would survive. The men he saved would remember him. The Marines who'd seen him deliberately steer back into the inferno, using his boat as a shield, knowing the cost, would tell the story again and again. The Medal of Honor citation would speak of extraordinary heroism, of leadership and courage beyond the call of duty. It would describe how Signalman First Class Douglas Albert Monroe, United States Coast Guard, had voluntarily entered a zone of heavy enemy fire to rescue surrounded Marines, how he'd provided covering fire, how he'd shielded another landing craft with his own, and how he'd given his life to ensure others escaped. The citation was formal and official, but it couldn't quite capture the reality. The split-second decisions, the physical courage of steering toward fire instead of away from it, the calm competence under impossible pressure, the final question about whether his Marines were safe. Back in Washington State, Edith Monroe received the telegram that every parent dreaded. Her son was dead, killed in action on some distant island fighting a war that had barely begun. The grief must have been crushing, the loss incomprehensible. But Edith Monroe was made of the same material as her son. When the shock passed, when the funeral was done, she made a decision that stunned everyone who knew her. She enlisted in the Coast Guard herself. She was 47 years old, well beyond the normal recruitment age, But the Coast Guard was expanding rapidly and needed experienced people for shore duties. They made an exception. Edith Monroe served through the rest of the war, working in administrative roles, helping coordinate the very kind of operations her son had died in. She wore the uniform her son had worn. She served the service he'd served. And perhaps, in doing so, she found a way to honor his memory that transcended grief, that transformed loss into purpose. The war ground on for 3 more years. Guadalcanal was eventually secured. The Japanese pushed back. The tide turned. More landings followed: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each one a nightmare of fire and blood, each one requiring men like Douglas Monroe to drive landing craft toward hostile shores. Thousands of Coast Guard personnel served in these operations, manning the boats, taking the casualties, doing the unglamorous but essential work that made the island-hopping campaign possible. Some became famous. Most remained anonymous. Monroe became something else, a symbol. He remains, to this day, the only member of the United States Coast Guard ever to receive the Medal of Honor. Think about that for a moment. An entire service, spanning more than 2 centuries, from revenue cutters chasing smugglers to modern cutters intercepting drug runners, from lighthouse keepers to helicopter rescue swimmers, from icebreakers in the Arctic to patrol boats in war zones. And only one man, in all that history, has been awarded the nation's highest decoration for valor. That singularity carries meaning. It speaks to the nature of the Coast Guard itself, a service that has always operated quietly, that saves lives rather than takes them, that measures success not in enemies destroyed but in people rescued. It speaks to the rarity of Coast Guard personnel being placed in direct combat situations where such extreme heroism can be demonstrated. And it speaks to the extraordinary nature of what Douglas Monroe did on that September morning in 1942. He didn't have to go back. His orders were to deliver troops and withdraw. No one would have questioned him for following those orders, for leaving the reef and heading to safety. But he saw men in desperate trouble, and his training, his character, his fundamental understanding of what service meant, demanded that he act. The decision cost him his life, but it saved dozens of others. That's not poetry or exaggeration. That's documented fact. The Marines he rescued went on to fight other battles, to return home, to live lives that wouldn't have been possible if Douglas Monroe had chosen differently in that crucial moment. There's a tendency, when speaking of heroes, to make them superhuman, to elevate them so high that ordinary people can't relate to them. But Douglas Monroe wasn't superhuman. He was a young man from the Pacific Northwest who joined the Coast Guard because it seemed like the right thing to do. He was good at his job, exceptional even, but he started out learning the basics like everyone else. He felt fear. The men who served with him said so. He got tired and frustrated and homesick. He was human in all the ways that matter. What made him extraordinary was how he responded when the moment came. He'd been trained to handle boats, to manage communications, to work as part of a team. That training prepared him technically, but it couldn't prepare him for the moral choice he faced when he saw those Marines trapped and dying. That choice came from somewhere deeper, from his upbringing, from his values, from whatever combination of character and courage that defines the best of human nature. The Coast Guard names ships after its heroes. There have been 2 ships named for Douglas Monroe: a high-endurance cutter commissioned in 1944, which served through the Cold War, and a fast-response cutter commissioned in 2019. That newer vessel patrols the Pacific, sometimes in waters not far from where Monroe died. The crews who serve aboard her know his story. They understand that they're carrying a legacy, that the name on their hull represents something worth aspiring to. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Douglas Monroe isn't a ship or a medal or a citation. It's the fact that his example endured, that the Coast Guard continued to produce men and women who embodied the same values, the same willingness to risk everything for others. In hurricane-ravaged cities, Coast Guard helicopters hover over rooftops, winching survivors to safety while wind and water try to kill everyone involved. On dark nights, small boats race toward distress signals, toward sinking vessels and drowning people, toward situations where the rescuers might themselves need rescue. In war zones, Coast Guard personnel still man small boats, still insert and extract troops, still provide the specialized skills that come from generations of experience with dangerous water. They do these things not for glory. The Coast Guard has never been about glory, but because the mission demands it, because people need help, because when you wear the uniform, you accept that some responsibilities transcend personal safety. Douglas Monroe understood that on a September morning in 1942, when he turned his landing craft back toward the fire instead of away from it, when he made himself a shield for others, when he died asking whether the Marines got off safely. The sun still rises over the Solomon Islands. The jungles have long since reclaimed the battlefields, and the young men who fought there are mostly gone now, claimed by time if not by war. But the water remains, and in a way so does Douglas Monroe. He's there in every Coast Guard coxswain who times a wave perfectly, bringing a boat through surf that seems impossible. He's there in every rescue swimmer who jumps into storm-churned seas. He's there in every person who wears the uniform and understands that service sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. He gave everything that morning, and in return, his name became immortal. Not in the sense of statues and monuments, though those exist, but in the sense of meaning something permanent, of standing for values that don't change regardless of era or technology or politics. Courage, duty, sacrifice. These aren't abstractions when you understand Douglas Monroe's story. They're real things, demonstrated in blood and fire, paid for with a life that should have stretched decades but instead ended at 23. That's the weight of heroism, the terrible price it sometimes demands. And that's why we remember. Not to glorify war. There's nothing glorious about watching young men die on distant beaches, but to honor the people who, when circumstances forced an impossible choice, chose rightly. Who saw what needed to be done and did it regardless of cost. Who proved that ordinary people, properly trained and motivated by ideals larger than themselves, are capable of extraordinary things. Douglas Albert Monroe, Signalman First Class, United States Coast Guard. The only member of his service ever awarded the Medal of Honor. Coxswain. Communicator. A young man from Washington who answered his nation's call and gave everything he had. The water that day off Point Cruz was stained red with his blood and the blood of the men he saved and the men he couldn't save. But he didn't turn away. He went back. And in the final analysis, perhaps that's the simplest and most profound truth of all. When it mattered most, when every instinct screamed to flee, Douglas Monroe went back. That decision defines him. That decision honors us all.